In this session, we are going to talk about leases and contracts. This is extremely important. It's important because when you buy a property, especially when you buy a property in the UK, you were buying, in most cases, either the land upon which the structure resides, or you're buying the building itself. In many ways, the best way to describe or to understand contracts is to imagine that there are different types of leases or contracts. The traditional approach is to have a building, and this building resides on a piece of land. You can purchase the land upon which the building resides, or you can purchase the land and the building, or you can purchase just the building itself. So this, in many ways, would be the first category. Now, there are several other categories of leases. You can buy rights, and this could be not on land, so in here we're referring to land. This could be on water, on a body of water. So you can lease maybe a structure on a body of water. You can own an island. You can even own the air rights. And all of these are examples of potential contracts that you might come across. I make reference to these two, water and air, just to make the point. Let me just expand on air rights, for example. This is not too it's not too, let's say, prevalent in the UK, but in some countries you can buy, imagine this to be very tall buildings, you can buy the rights, the air rights above a particular building. In other words, once you bought, let's say you're the owner of this 200-story building and you have exceptional views of the city, and you're worried that someone else who owns that property could buy, or rather could sell the property to someone else, and the new owner might develop a structure that restricts what would be, or what you would consider to be, the most important part of the value of this building, which is the views. In that case, you could approach the owner of this property and buy the rights, the air rights, which means you buy the air rights, and that means you can stop any future owner from developing a structure. So I simply wanted to just make you aware that contracts and leases do not necessarily apply just to land or landed buildings. They can apply to structures in water, but also they can apply to just air. So let's move very quickly into what I'll consider to be two types of leases that you might be involved in. The first is what we call the freehold, and the second is what we call the leasehold. I am only going to discuss these contracts from the perspective of what you should know before you make an offer to purchase a property. I have no intentions of going into the legal or the very descriptive aspects of these contracts. If you're buying a freehold, we call that fee simple. This means that you own the property, the land, the building in its entirety. if you purchase just a flat or a number of flats in a building, you might be buying just the leasehold rather. So there would be a landlord. So for freeholders, you are what we'll call the landlord. And for leaseholders, you are what we'll call the tenant. As you would imagine, it would mean that as the tenant, you would have to pay the landlord a rent. The rent will be based on a contract, which is where the lease comes in. The lease is simply a description of various parts of what constitutes the contract. That would include the duration of the contract, what is included in the contract, the responsibilities of both parties in the contract, and sometimes it goes as far as describing circumstances under which the contract could be altered or changed. So most people who purchase properties in the UK, particularly in London, would normally buy leaseholds. And the reason is simply because if you're buying a flat, or if you're looking to buy in London, entire buildings are quite expensive, especially in the areas that are quite posh, or in areas that are quite upscale, upmarket. Within inner London, it's much more expensive. So most people usually buy just a flat. They might buy one flat, a 1-bedroom flat, 2-bedroom flat, a 3-bedroom flat, but not the entire building. This would mean that you buying the property, you would be what we call the leaseholder, and you would be seeking to get a lease from the freeholder, who is the landlord. You would be the tenant. Don't let that put you off. And the reason is because some of these leaseholds can go as much as 150 years, even up to 999 years. So it's not a short-term lease. In effect, you own the flat you're buying, and I will explain in more details as we go further. There's something called enfranchisement. And this is a legal process that allows the leaseholder to buy the freehold from the landlord, providing they meet very specific conditions. So for example, you could, in principle, you could buy a flat, and after a number of years, you decide that you're paying too much in rent, or you decide that the landlord is not maintaining the building as he should or as she should, and therefore you decide, why don't I join with the other owners and let's buy the entire freehold so that we become part owners of this entire structure, and therefore we can take control and we can maintain and manage the building more effectively. The process is what we call enfranchisement, and there's something also called extensions. If you buy a lease, let's say it's a 90-year lease, for every day you own the house, for every year you own the house, the lease reduces. It's important to maintain the lease at a certain minimum duration. Otherwise, the costs of enfranchising or the cost of extending the lease becomes quite burdensome. So the reason I wanted to just bring that up is when you're buying a property, one of the first questions you should always ask is it a leasehold? And if the answer is yes, the next question is, what is the amount remaining on the lease? Once you start to approach 80 years and below, you should be worried, because it would cost you a lot of money to extend the lease. In addition to that, let me just share something that I believe you should know. Once it goes below 80 to 79, it gets much more expensive. But more importantly, when you're a leaseholder, once you've purchased a property, you're not allowed, well, up until today, there are some legislations and legal proposals put forward to the UK government to alter and to change the enfranchisement laws. But when you buy a property, you're not allowed to extend the lease or to buy the freehold within the first 2 years. You have to wait for 2 years. So imagine you were to buy a lease that had 75 years left, which is a little bit worrying, and you had to wait for 2 years, which would mean it would be 73 years by the time you're ready to buy it, and it takes a few months to complete the process. It would mean that the cost you would pay, sometimes the cost you would pay between a 75-year lease and a 73-year lease could be as much as 2,000 to 5,000, all depending on the property. So ideally, you would like to keep your lease at 80 years and above. If you could, 90 years and above. So the first thing I can mention is always ask, is this property leasehold or is it freehold? If it's freehold, there's very little for me to say on freehold leases because it simply means you are the landlord. You have bought the entire building and you've also bought the land. Now, let me qualify that. There are some times when flats could be sold as freehold. In other words, you're buying a share of the freehold. So you would be a part landlord, which is much better than being just the leaseholder. So just bear that in mind. Now, let's move on quickly because I think one of the most exciting parts of purchasing a property, in my opinion, is to understand what's in the lease. Very important. When you're buying a property, the way the process works, and I covered this in a prior session. I tried to explain that there are stages that you have to go through before you get to the point, or before you get to a position where you're, I guess, ready for the purchase to go through. If you're purchasing the property with cash, then technically the duration of the purchase process can be reduced. However, if you're purchasing the property with the aid of a mortgage or with the aid of support from the bank, the process is somewhat delayed. And the reason it's delayed is because you have to get a mortgage in principle. The property has to be valued on behalf of the bank. Then the mortgage is approved, and then the lawyers and the legal team are able to exchange documents and finalize the purchase process. But I'd like to very quickly just show you something that we discussed in one of the previous sessions. I made reference to this flow diagram where I said stage one is that you discover the property, you find something, you like it, you make an offer. As part of the offer is accepted. If you're buying with the support of a bank or a mortgage, then it means the mortgage has to be approved, including the purchase. The bank will then instruct a survey to be undertaken to verify and to validate that the building is fit for purpose and it's worthy of investing or worthy of the bank's investment. That survey is done by a surveyor. Once that's done, the report is sent to you, the buyer. It's also provided to the bank. The lender then decides to go forward, proceed. They issue a mortgage certificate, or the mortgage is approved and your mortgage accepted by the bank, to put in better terms, and then the purchase goes through. I made reference to the fact that the purpose of this session that I have been doing with you is to provide you with enough information so that at this stage you have a better understanding about whether the investment is worthy of further pursuit or whether you should walk away. Most of what I'm sharing you would normally discover at this stage. And a few weeks and months and money would have been expended. So, in leases, in dealing with leases, one of the key things to understand is if you can obtain as much information about the lease as you can, the better for you. And having just explained this flow diagram, let me go back to the conversation that we were having. I was trying to explain that the most important part of the lease is, in my opinion, the contents of the lease. Most people are deceived into thinking that once a lease has a good duration left, then it must be good. No. And let me explain this. Imagine you're buying this property, but in this case, imagine that this is the front of the property. Also imagine that the property has a rear garden, and that to be a tree, and you're looking to buy the ground floor of the property. And let's say that there are two other floors, two other apartments or flats in the property. Let's assume that you have a family, but your family is growing and you need more space. And therefore, your interest in buying this property is simply because you would like to extend the property so that you can maybe provide an additional habitable space, maybe an extra living room or an extra bedroom, maybe for an expectant child, or maybe for a bigger, just more space for the family. Doesn't matter what your reasons are. It's important to know what the lease has contained within before you make the purchase. I have seen, and I know of people who have made a purchase only to find out that the proposed value enhancements that they were looking to do were not feasible. Some other people, sometimes you could be buying this top floor and your intention is to extend it and put a dormer, which is simply an extension, which would then provide you with an additional room, maybe a bedroom and a bathroom. However, you have to be explicit. You have to look at the lease. The contents are important. Now, let me go through the lease very quickly and the sections of the lease that you should draw your attention to. Now, this is important whether you are able to get this information at this stage or at this stage. The information, or rather the information I'm about to share, is important, irrespective of what stage in this flow diagram you're able to get it. The sooner, the better. The first part is the description. Of the demise. And what's this? The lease diagram will always state the demise. I'll give you a good example. Let's say you're buying the top floor flat, and this is before the dormer proposal. It's just a simple flat, what we would call a loft flat. You have the presupposition, you believe that if you can buy the top floor flat, then you can carry out some extension works to enhance the value of your investment. The description of the demise might say that this flat includes the walls surrounding of which the property is part of. So usually leases are very, very good in descriptions. It would state that your demise contains or includes the walls. It would state that it includes, imagine that to be the floor, and imagine that to be the ceiling. It would normally state that your lease includes half the distance between the ceiling of the floor below and the floor of which is yours. So effectively you get half of this, which means you can have services like cables or pipes in the floor joists, and it would also include half of top of the ceiling to the top of the floor joist. Then it includes the walls. It would include the windows, and sometimes, rather most times, it would also say, in this case, it includes the roof. Now, this is where we become very, 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 very attentive. The reason is simply because some leases will state that the demise only includes up until half the space, the void space between the ceiling and the roof, effectively the roof joists. Now here's why it's important. If the lease does not explicitly state that the void, the roof void, or the roof space, or the roof loft is included in your lease, then it means it is not included. In addition to that, if the lease does not state that the roof itself is yours or is included in the demise, then you cannot assume that it is. This simply means your vision or your proposal, maybe to put some roof lights and to put an extension, will not be feasible. What that would mean is that the roof itself belongs to the landlord, and therefore the landlord has the contractual rights to refuse any construction or any modification to the roof. However, in some cases, it will include the roof and the void. Now you have to be very, very careful, because sometimes it would state that the roof is included, but it doesn't state that the void is included. Now, you might argue that this is a matter of semantics. This is something for the lawyers and the solicitors to argue, but you have to be careful. So I would simply say the first thing you want to draw your attention to is the content. Under the content, we talked about description of the demise. What's included? Number 2, lessor and lessee and their responsibilities. Now let me expand on that. In this case, I always like to use the top floor. In other words, the floor just underneath the roof, and the reason is because it tends to cover so much more than if it was simply a flat that is sandwiched. Just imagine that to be a house, and there's another floor, ground floor, first floor, second floor. The first floor tends to be fairly easy because it basically just states that what belongs to you is the wall, the space inside, the windows on the wall, any roof within what the layout of this space. But because it's sandwiched between two flats, there's not much to say. The ground floor is usually the same, with the exception that sometimes it might have a garden. And the question you want to know is whether the garden is shared or whether it's yours. If the garden is not shared and you have a private garden, remember that the land is still the landlord's. So you cannot build on the land without the landlord's consent, which usually, the way the leases are written, it states that the landlord should not withhold unduly any request from the leaseholder, providing that the request is consistent with the lease. So I like to use the top floor. Now, I'd like you to just observe this. Imagine that to be the chimney, and that to be the roof, and the wall and the structure. In terms of responsibilities, if you're buying that top floor, there are times when it would state that the chimney is included within your demise, and that the responsibility for maintaining the chimney is within your demise. In other words, you're responsible for it. Now, why is this important? Well, if this building contains 3 flats and the three of you are responsible for the entire structure and for maintaining and repairing and ensuring the building and the various structures on the land. It would mean that the other two tenants would pay for the repairs to the walls and to the ground and the floors and the boundary walls. However, they will not be responsible for the chimney because it's within your responsibility. Sometimes he would also state that the roof itself is within your demise, which would also mean that you were responsible for it. Now, ideally, you do not want to be solely responsible for any external structure. Ideally, it's always important to make sure that you read the lease. Do not rely on your legal counsel, your solicitor, to read your lease and tell you what, I guess, you should be worried or you should pay attention to. So number two. Number three is, I would say, responsibility for repairs, restrictions, and insurance. Responsibility for repairs, the restrictions, and insurance. Quickly, who's responsible for repairing what? There are times when the lease will state that the leaseholders are responsible for maintaining and repairing all aspects of the building or specific areas of the building, and the landlord is responsible for specific areas of the building. You need to understand who is responsible. There are also times where it would state that the landlord has the right to override the leaseholders if the leaseholders are not providing or have not been meeting their responsibilities. For example, if the lease states that you, the leaseholder, are responsible for maintaining and repairing the external facade or the external walls, and there is a damage and it's not repaired, the landlord has the right to send in people, get the works done, have it fixed, and then charge you. And in addition to that, charge you any management fee or any administration fee. So it's always important to check what's included. The final thing that I would make reference to, and this is so important. I have seen so much unnecessary pain caused as a result of a lack of understanding, both on the sales agent's part, the buyer, and the seller in relation to the layout of the demise. Let me explain very carefully what I mean by this. You found a property. It's an entire house. This is you, front of the house. This is the rear of the house. And this is the garden. The seller, unfortunately, maybe because most people never look at their lease document. So he's never, or she has never looked at the lease documents. They decide to sell the property. They bring in an agent. The owner has owned the property for a very, very long time. There's a fence. And let's say the owner has owned this property for 10 years. To the rear of this building is another property. However, maybe this property has not been maintained as regularly as it should, and therefore it's a bit derelict. Over the years, let's say before this owner purchased the property, the person who owned it before, whilst trying to repair the roof, they install the fence into the boundary or beyond the boundary of their land and onto the adjacent neighbor's property. The new owner buys it, believing that his property extends all the way up to this point, without realizing, no, it's actually all the way up to here. He decides to sell the property. He lists the property based on that. You come and you buy the property. Someone comes and finally buys this property. But the title document or the lease document actually has the original boundaries there. And so what tends to happen is you then have a legal dispute between both owners. Why? Simply because when you were buying the property, you went with the sales brochure, which had shown the property to be that much. So you have to be careful. I'll give you a different one. You're buying a flat. In the sales document, the flat has, imagine this to be the front of the building. The building has some bins, call this a bin store, and it has a two-way driveway, right? And you're buying property number one. However, because you're not aware at the point when you're viewing the property, you're not aware of the legal contents of the lease, the sales document states that this property is for sale as a leasehold, but also states that the grounds are shared. The front car park and the rear garden are both shared. And in this case, you view the property, you're happy with the property, and so you make an offer to buy the property, only to discover that once you've made an offer, it's been accepted, you sign the contract, you look at the lease document and you realize that the lease states that the property's demise is simply that you're allowed access to the bin store, you're allowed access to the rear garden, but that the front car parks belong to the ground floor flat and the second floor flat. So suddenly you've overpaid for a property because you assumed that you were getting or you had access to the driveway as well. You didn't allow a discount to the property price, and you paid the full price. So it's important to just bear that in mind. So I guess the layout of the demise is always important. It's always good to check the lease, because the lease will always have the original layout. And remember, the sales